Gradcast. This one is with Professor Bob Wood of Business Technology in the Institute of Management at the University of Bolton. How are you today?
I'm very well indeed, thank you. Still managing to survive lockdown, but otherwise fine.
Wow, it's a crazy time, isn't it? This will lockdown ever end?
I'm sure it will. I think what's, in a sense, what is potentially very interesting, particularly for somebody like me, is how it will end.
Yeah.
In other words, what will come next. I think there'll be certain shifts in behaviour, but I guess only time will tell as far as those concerned. I don't think it's going to be quite the clean break that everybody seems to imagine. I think it's going to go on for quite a long time as we adjust and change. But yeah, interesting times, as they say.
Yeah, it is. I think it's changed the face of everything, education, business, forever, really, hasn't it? You know, the way that we've had to adapt and change. I can't really imagine it going back to sitting in lecture theatres and, you know, all hundreds of students. I can't imagine that happening again. I think maybe times have shifted and new ways of teaching and working are probably going to be adopted forever. Well,
I think that's exactly right in terms of that's the challenge. I'm not quite as, I guess, as clear-cut as you are about that being the change. Partly because I come from a technology background, I've seen these sort of claims about major shifts in behavior so many times before, particularly in education. You know, this is not the first time we've talked about having major shifts in the way we deliver classes, lectures, material, etc., etc. And it's surprising me how conservative, not just on the part of academics, but also interesting on the part of students. You know, students by and large do enjoy, you know, going to university and going to, you know, I'm sure they do moan quite a lot, but that's just how people are. But if you look at the reaction to the way that it's been shifted,
yeah,
to online, which in a sense we should have been doing years ago, but we didn't. And one of the reasons why we didn't is because people resisted on both sides.
Yeah.
So this has been a major disturbance. But whether we will simply breathe a big sigh of relief and all the students will flood back into classes as indeed children have done, as you say, time will tell. I think there are one or two interesting shifts which are maybe not that desirable. I saw a recent report where if you look at this year's applications, although applications generally to university are up again, there's been a shift in balance to students applying to their local university.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because in a sense that, you know, the shock of, or the concern they've had about paying lots of fees for residences, yeah, and then effectively losing that money has made them very cautious. So they're thinking, well, if I'm gonna have to be at home for whatever reason, I'll be at home and I'll save, which is probably not good news for their parents, but but you know, that would be a major shift, because going and living somewhere else when you go to university has always been a major driving force in the past of students wanting to get away, living somewhere else, going for that independence. But I suspect there might be a big kickback against, you know, big halls of residence, for example.
Yeah.
So students have had bad experiences. So we'll see. Office work is the other one. You know, whether we'll go back. I think there'll be some major shifts there, but probably driven more by economics. Again, you know, companies are already downsizing. They're letting go a lot of buildings because they're just very, very expensive.
Yeah.
So
if they can be productive at home on
absolutely
Zoom, then why would you be paying all this?
Yep. Yeah. So that shifts the pressure and the balance back to workers. I mean, it all sounds very attractive. It does for the middle classes and people like me. You know, I'm more than happy working at home, but not for people who don't necessarily want to be based in their own house, paying their heating charges, paying, you know, additionality, and not being able to go to an office. So yeah. But clearly only time will tell.
Yeah, you're right. I miss people. I miss the proper face of chatting to people, the dynamics you get.
Yeah.
That's what I hope we get back. But we could spend all day talking
Yes,
about
we could.
And this is about you, talking about your educational path. So,
Right.
how did you find education going right back to sort of school level? How was education for you?
Loved it.
Did you?
Absolutely loved it. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why I ended up as an academic and as a professor. You know, if I could have stayed at school all my life, I would have done, basically. I've started going going right back. My mother, I was born just south of Manchester, and the local sort of infant school, which at that time you would go to at the age of 5, was literally at the end of my road, as it were. And my mother would tell me that I used to go and sit outside in the sort of summertime, in the warm days. There was iron railings around the school, and I would sit outside while the kids were being taught in the playground. Right?
Oh.
I was so keen to go to school. So I've been very fortunate in the sense that I did love it. I was also clearly, I was reasonably bright, which meant that all through schooling, I did pretty well, generally speaking. I was, I'm a post-Second World War baby boomer, so I was brought up on the 11 plus. I passed the 11 plus, which I was fully expected to do, but not as well as my parents hoped. So I eventually went to grammar school. I went to 2 different grammar schools. One was a co-educational one in Lancashire. And then at 14, I switched to an all-boys grammar school on the Wirral in Cheshire, which was...
Why did you change?
My dad changed jobs.
Oh, change job.
Yeah, so we just had to move and I had to follow him. So that was actually quite traumatic because for 2 reasons. One is that moving from a co-educational school with lots of girls in to an all-boys grammar school was a dreadful experience, I have to say. I really disliked but I'm glad it was that way around. I don't think I could have survived if it was the other way around. And the other was they didn't play football. And I've always been a big football fan, big football player.
Who's your team? Who'd you like?
United.
Oh, I'm a Man City fan. We can't talk.
Well, you're all right now, you see.
Yeah.
I kind of say I've been a Man United fan since I was 6 years old. My granddad used to take me to Old Trafford just before the Munich air crash. So I remember all of that. He was a season ticket holder at Old Trafford, and he used to take me from the age of 6 and 7. So I've been a United fan ever since then. It's
good to speak to a United fan that isn't from London.
Oh, I know. Don't give me that. Don't give me that. Right? I've got loads of friends who are City fans, although they kept it quiet for many years until the last. I know. I don't mind. Because you guys have gone through so much misery over. I don't begrudge that. I once remind people when we're talking about football, particularly my middle son, who was a big United fan, but he was only a fan during the Ferguson years. So once that ended, he's got really miserable. And I keep saying to him, look, you just count yourself lucky. You should have gone back to 20 years before Ferguson came. But I remember, and this is absolutely true, I went to see City play against Macclesfield when they were down in what I think then was Division 2 or Division 3. So, those were the grim days for City fans. So I don't mind. I'm a big United fan. But this was a rugby playing school. That was the point. My dad couldn't even pluck up the courage to tell me. It was only when I got there, because I went in the middle of the year, and it was only when I got to the school and saw these rugby posts, and I said to my dad, what? And he said, sorry, but they don't play football.
Oh, no football and no girls.
That's right, yeah, exactly. But in fact, it probably worked out quite well, because of course those were my O-level years and then my A-level years, so it was probably no bad thing. So yeah, so my schooling was very, very conventional. I went through O-levels. I then did double maths and economics at A level, and then applied for university in the classic days that you did. It was just, that was the thing that was expected of you. I never questioned it. I never imagined for one moment that I wouldn't go to university, because everything had been built up to that point. It was only when I started to choose universities and choose subjects that I began to kind of think about things in a different way. And as we were just saying a few moments ago about applying to universities, I wanted a university that was pretty far away from where I lived. That was a major thing. I didn't want to go to London, but on the other hand, I wanted to go somewhere reasonably far away. So that was clear. But the other thing was, I was going to choose economics. I'd done economics at A level. I thought reading economics at university would be the obvious thing to do. But then I started to think, well, 3 years of doing theoretical economics, is that really what I wanted to do? So I started to look around for some rather more, if you like, practical based. And the idea of aligning economics to business was something that really interested me, rather more sort of application, because I was starting to think about having a career after I left university. So that's what I did. That's when I started to change my view, at least for a period of time. So after I graduated, at that time, we used to have what they called a milk round, which was, the big companies would come to universities, and they would basically offer you jobs. And I try and explain that to undergraduates these days, and they kind of look and go, whoa, But then I remind them that, only 5% of the population went to a university in the 1960s, the late 1960s. It was 5% of the eligible people. I think people today, if they didn't live through that period, don't really understand the shift and the change there's been in university education. Now it's closer to 50% of eligible people, and it's increasing, which is, arguably either a good or a bad thing, depending on your point of view. Personally, I think it's a good thing. The more people can go to university, the higher they can be educated. I believe firmly, the better. But I don't think anybody should do it just for the sake of it. And maybe we can touch on this when we get to talking about doctoral education, because that's much more specialized.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I chose a job with a very large engineering group of companies. It sounded interesting. They were looking for people to do what was then called operational research, which was a mixture of sort of mathematical modeling and economics applied to business, which is what I'd done for my degree. And it was a time when big companies like that, they would have management training schemes, they would have big operational research groups or management science groups. This was a company of, I don't know how many individual organizations they had, but they were all over different engineering products, car parts, steel, metals, the whole range of manufacturing and engineering products that Britain was doing in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So it was perfect for me. I got a lot of good training. I got to do a lot of interesting work. So really, I was kind of set. That was me. That was going to be my career. And the other thing that happened over that period was that I joined the computer department, because that was what was happening. Early 1970s. It was all about firms getting computers. And this is the one story I always tell my undergraduates when I'm teaching, that the very first computer department I worked in had one computer for the entire group. The entire group of companies had one computer, an IBM 370 mainframe. It's astonishing. It is truly astonishing when you think back.
Yeah.
So, I was young, I was well qualified. This was the future. It seemed the obvious way to go, and clearly it was. So I switched over to computing, programming, design, database, all of the usual things. And I was set on a career. I had a wife and a child, young child at the time. As far as I was concerned, that was going to be my career. And then, and this is where the link to my PhD and to doctoral education is just entirely individualistic. And I would not recommend this to anybody, right? Because I was on my way home one night from work, and I've been getting a bit fed up at work. I was thinking about changing jobs anyway, just because some of the stuff we were doing was quite routine, got quite boring. I wanted to do more interesting applications. I was also frustrated by something that became, in a sense, the determining factor, I suppose, in my professional life, which was why companies were spending so much money building applications that nobody wanted.
Okay.
I couldn't figure out, we would, at that time, we would take maybe 12 months, 18 months to build a big application system. We would work incredibly hard. We would speak to users. We would interview managers, and then we'd go live and we'd launch the system. And within a matter of days or weeks, we were being told this is not what we want. This was not what we were after. This is not helping, and I just got more and more frustrated, and then began to think, well, why is it? Why? Just nagging me all the time. Anyway, I was on my way home. I bumped into an old friend who I'd been an undergraduate with, who said, "Oh, let's go and have a drink and catch up." So I said, "Yeah, good idea." So we went to the pub, and he was doing a PhD in labor economics. And I said to him, "Well, why are you doing a PhD? What a ridiculous notion, right?" And he said, "Well, it's great and it's fun." And he said, "We're looking for PhD." He said, "They're looking for PhD students, particularly in areas like technology. Why don't you do a PhD?" And I said, "Why? Why would I want to do, for God's sake, of all?" Anyway, I came out with the application form, filled it in, and sent it off the next day.
Wow.
And that was it. So that's how I came to do a PhD, which I think is probably not a good lesson for anybody. I wouldn't recommend that.
Why do you say that? Why do you think?
No, I think just in terms of probably wasn't the best way to make a decision when I'd had 3 or 4 pints of bitter. And
I don't know. I seem to work out for you.
Well, maybe it was. Maybe it was.
So did you not go down the master's route first? You went straight onto
no,
PhD?
I went straight to that's absolutely right. I didn't, and I don't think there's necessarily any great connection between masters and PhD. This is an interesting point we've talked about many times over the years. A lot of students do that. Although I think generally it's because they think, oh, well, I've done a first degree, so I really ought to do a master's. When you've done a master's, everything narrows down, doesn't it? So you have a lot of people doing a first degree, and an awful lot of people now. So they get a first degree and they think, well, that's really not, that doesn't differentiate me enough. That's really not special anymore. So I tell you what, I'll do a master's. They normally do a master's based on what their first degree was, obviously. So that narrows it down. Then when you've done a master's, I think you go one of two ways. Either the student thinks, right, now I'm better qualified in that area, so I'll go and work or whatever. Or they get the bug for it and they think, particularly when you've done your project, you've done a master's project. I think that for a lot of students is, oh, I really would like to do, this is much more interesting. I want to pursue this. And that is the fundamental difference, right? It's that why so many very clever undergraduate students don't make good PhD students, because the very skills and qualities that gave them a very good, exceptional first degree are not necessarily the same qualities that they need to be a researcher.
That's interesting.
Right. That thought about this many times over the years. PhD, and maybe we can touch on this if you want to, but to do a PhD, requires a number, I think, of very, very specific characteristics and qualities in an individual. And they're not all to do with necessarily with what you would think of as intelligence. You know, some of them are without a doubt, but not all of them. I think that's the big difference. The other big difference is independence. Even at master's level, apart, as I say, probably from the dissertation, you're pretty much told what to do.
Yeah.
Even in a dissertation, it's generally speaking, you know, the tutor that sets the topic or tells you the way that he or she wants the work done. You get to a PhD, and the first thing your supervisor says is, right, you know, go and think for yourself.
Yeah. What did you
don't ask me.
Yeah.
I have to tell you a story. I once had a head of school at one university that I worked at, and his PhD was in mathematics from Cambridge. He was a very, very clever man, without a doubt. And he went to do his PhD at Cambridge. And in the course of 3 years at Cambridge, he met his director and supervisor 3 times, right? 3 times he spoke to him. Wow. The first time was the day he started, and his supervisor said to him, right, he gave him a piece of paper with a mathematical equation on. And he said, I want you to go away and solve this equation. Come back when you've solved it. So a week later, he went back with his solution, and his supervisor looked at him and said, right, okay, that's good. Then he gave him another piece of paper, and he said, right, he said, this is your PhD. He said, I want you to go away and solve this equation for any number. Off you go. And the third time he met him was on the day he submitted his thesis.
Oh my gosh.
Right? Wow. Now I know that's extreme, and that's Cambridge, and it's mathematics, but it does give you some indication of the very different relationships that supervisors have with their PhD students. They range, the complete range of forms of relationships. So I think if a PhD student enters into it thinking that there's a single model, or thinking that they're going to meet every week or every fortnight, or, you know, they really need to rethink their view on it. I'm not suggesting for a moment that meeting 3 times in the course of your, but he did get his PhD, incidentally, I have to say. But that's because he was very, very clever. But you know, somewhere in between those 2 extremes is a balance.
Yeah.
Is a balance. And it is important. It's important, obviously, that the student understands that, but also gets the right balance for them. Yeah. That's something you have to work out. Yeah. Because supervisors, you know, generally speaking, supervisors do have a particular model that they've worked on. I think I've over the years built up a model that I kind of follow, but I wouldn't for one moment argue that it's the only one or necessarily the right one. It's just my preferred way of working with PhD students. But it's important that you work that out with your supervisor, so you're both comfortable. You know, right from early on, right from the beginning, forge a way of working.
Yeah. So what happened for your PhD after that night in the pub?
Oh, right. Well, I could talk for a long time about this, because this was, for me, this was a really, really pivotal moment in my life, okay? So there were 2 parts of it. So I signed up, had to do an outline proposal, clearly, which I did. And it was based on what I was saying to you before about this problem that I'd had in my head, yeah, about application. Why does technology fail? Why do we build these systems that nobody wants? You know, it's ridiculous. There's got to be a better way of doing it. And I think that's important for all students. I try and say to them, you know, when I'm talking at seminars or when we have meetings, you must have something like that in your mind. You must be driven by some sense of a problem to be solved. I think that's very, very important to have. Anyway, so I got this. I took it to my nominated supervisor, who looked at it and said, yeah, okay. He said, there's something I need to tell you. So I said, okay. He said, I've never supervised before.
Oh.
So I said, right, okay. You might have told me this before I sort of signed on and gave up my job and all the rest of it. Okay, so but that was basically the first thing he told me was that he'd never supervised a student before. And the second thing he told me was that I might want to find a more experienced supervisor for myself.
Right.
He was happy to act as a sort of second supervisor, but he thought it might be worth my while. So I thought, yeah, it does sound like a good idea. Now, this is quite a long story, so I'll cut it very short, but it's absolutely crucial. So I went away and thought, okay, who could I get? You know, and I kind of thought about the stuff I'd read as an undergraduate that had influenced me. And there were 2 or 3 books that really very strongly influenced me. And they were co-written by 2 people. One of whom was, funnily enough, ironically, a professor at Manchester Business School called Enid Mumford. He was a very famous professor. And she'd written a couple of books with another person called Tom Ward. And as I was a little afraid about approaching Enid because she was a professor at Manchester. Although, funnily enough, 20 years later, I got to know her very, very well, which is quite nice. But so I decided I would approach Tom. The reason why I approached Tom is because he was a visiting professor at Manchester at the time. But he was also the director of IT for Littlewoods mail order stores in Liverpool. Okay? And that really interested me. And this is important because this has been something that's been very much a driving force for me over all of my career. I kind of like the idea that he was both a visiting prof, an academic, and a solid business person. Yeah. That he had, this senior management role in IT. So I just wrote to him, just wrote him a letter explaining what I was hoping to do. And basically saying, would you be my director of studies? And I got a letter back. And these are in the good old days, right? These are pre-email days and pre-mobile phones. So these are in the good old days. So I got a letter back straight away.
See, technology.
Oh, I know. Actually, you see, having said that, I think that one of the lessons that I hope will be learned from the pandemic, I think, is how technology has actually stood up remarkably well.
Yeah.
I don't think it's really getting enough credit for reliance and the what am I trying to say? The sort of resilience of systems has been actually quite remarkable, and yet, as with many things with technology, it just gets taken for granted.
Yeah.
But anyway, so.
Okay, so you were talking about finding your own supervisor.
Yes, that's right.
So if we just start that bit again, I'm so sorry.
We'll no, not your fault. I'll try and cut it down a little bit, but I just wanted to emphasize this bit for 2 reasons, which I'll come to, because for me, it was a very important moment. So to say, I approached Tom Ward by letter and got a very nice positive reply back, and saying yes, he was very delighted to meet with me. Didn't know what it would involve, but he was certainly interested. Would I like to meet him? So, and he sent it from his home address. When I looked at the home address, I thought, I know that address. It rings a bell. Anyway, it was in the same place where my parents lived, on the Wirral. So I went home for the weekend, and on the Friday evening, I went up to Tom's house. And as soon as I got there, I knew I'd been there before, which is why I recognized his son had been a friend of mine at school.
Oh, wow.
Even though I'd never made the connection between the 2 of them. And the front door opened, and it was his wife, who I had met. And she said, I knew it was you. She said, I told Tom it was you. So that was great. Anyway, we went into his front room, and it was absolutely lined with books. The whole room was just full of shelves full of books. So we sat down, and he said, right, tell me what you want to do for this PhD. Just talk me through it. So for about 45 minutes, I sort of went through, and I got everything, and I built it all up, and I really wanted to impress him and that. So I spent about 45, he listened, sat there very quietly and patiently. And then when I finished, he said, right, he said, well, that's a lot of rubbish. I said, I wouldn't bother doing that. Complete waste of time. So I was completely deflated, as you could imagine, right? So I'm thinking, oh, God, you know. He said, now, just wait a minute. And he went round and he just pulled about 7 or 8 books off his shelves. And my dad always used to remember this story because I kind of staggered back home with these books. And my dad used to say, he always reminds me coming through the front door with this enormous pile of books, right? And Tom said to me, he said, go and read those. He said, and when you've read those, come back and we'll talk about research. And he was absolutely right. And they were just mind-blowing books. And I think that's the other thing I just wanted to say to people. We were talking about, you know, having a problem to solve, having something that you know, is really important and is a challenge. But I think the other side of the equation is ensuring that students have a very strong theoretical basis in an area that they not only understand, but in a sense want to understand, want to find out more about. And one of the things I always try and impress upon PhD students is the fact they're going to be spending 3 to 4 years of their lives, right, studying this topic. Don't do it if it doesn't interest you. Don't do it if it doesn't excite you.
Yeah.
Right? Because that will be a waste of time, just as Tom said to me that, you know, I'm sure he was right, it would have been a waste of time. And this is one of the problems we were talking a little while ago about moving from a master's to a PhD. You quite often get students who will come to you with their master's dissertation. And they'll say, oh, you know, I've done this, it's really interesting. Now I want to do it for a PhD. And in almost all of my experience of that, it's never been a good basis for a PhD. It may set you off thinking about something. It may sort of stimulate your interest in it. That's fine, but it's rarely the basis. You know, the PhD has to be something different. So if you're the one, if it is you that's defining the area as opposed to your supervisor, and that varies from discipline to discipline, of course. But if it's you that's defining the area, then I think you really have to have a strong basis upon which you often, students will tell you, oh, there hasn't been any work done in this area, that's why, or nothing's been published about this topic. And my response is always, well, that's probably because it's not worth doing. You know, you've got to be very careful about saying, you know, nobody's done it before or nobody's published in this area. That may be true, although these days it's increasingly difficult to make that claim. But it can often be because it's not worth doing, or it can't be done. You know, the topic is simply too difficult. So you've got to give some really careful thought. And I was very, very fortunate, I think, in the fact that Tom, always grateful to him for the fact that he was able to really guide me and focus me on a topic that ended up, I think, both being worth doing and had this very powerful underpinning. So that's how I did it, and that's what I then spent the next sort of 3 years working on, and enjoyed I have to say, enjoyed every moment of it.
Yeah.
You know, it can be, and I think this is something else I'd like to stress. It should be enjoyment. It should be pleasure. It can be hard, of course it can. Incredibly challenging, often very lonely. This is something that a lot of students underestimate. Yeah, this is your work, nobody else's. Probably nobody else even working close to what you're working on. So it's very hard to talk about sometimes to anybody else, even other PhD students. What you can talk to them about, and I think what something like the association tries to do, which is absolutely right, is share your experiences of being a PhD student.
Yes.
That's what you have in common. But the subject, the topic, the theory, you know, all of that has to be very individualistic. So there is a big tension, I think, there quite often for students. But that was, and then the final part of it, that was whilst I was doing the PhD, I also started doing some lecturing, mainly because it paid. So pretty desperately in need of money. I was very fortunate in that I did get a scholarship, and I did have all my fees paid. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do it, obviously. But so I was quite lucky. But it was still, it still wasn't a huge amount of money. As I said, I had a wife and child to bring up, so being able to do some teaching, part-time teaching, and being paid for it was a real bonus. But I also loved it. I loved the teaching. So by the time I'd finished the research, started looking for jobs, that was it. I decided I wanted to be a university lecturer, and really that was then the starting point of the rest of my professional career, and that's what I've done ever since. Different universities, different levels, ending up ultimately. Well, I thought I'd ended up at Manchester. This was after the merger between the Victoria University and UMIST, and I ended up taking early retirement. But I knew a couple of people at Bolton who I'd known for a number of years who were good friends. They knew I was retiring and said, well, if you're retiring from Manchester, why don't you come and do 2 days a week at Bolton with us, helping research, helping develop research. And I said, great. So that's how I got involved with Bolton. So I do 2 days a week at Bolton and roughly 2 days a week at Manchester with my PhD students, MSc projects, that kind of thing. So it's a really nice balance as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, two very contrasting universities.
Well, to be fair, I mean, I was trying to think it through while we were talking there. I think I probably worked in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably 6. No, more than that, maybe 7 or 8 different universities, a couple of which were polytechnics before they became universities. So, of course, they had a very different culture.
Yeah.
I think universities are very individualistic. Yeah. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences quite clearly. So, of course, one of the reasons I was at Salford before I moved to Manchester, and Salford was a sort of middle-ranking ex-College of Advanced Technology in a very difficult geographical area. Salford's always been problematic in terms of its reputation, in terms of the place itself. University always struggled from that point of view, but was a good, solid academic university, and we did very well in the sort of research evaluation exercises. Then 3 of us moved to Manchester in 2002, and of course that's Russell Group. And the reason for moving was because we believed, I mean, it's like being a footballer, isn't it? You go from the first division to the championship because you want to get in the Premiership. That's what drives most footballers, whether you achieve it or not. And if you get in the Premiership, then you want to play in Europe, type of thing. I mean, that's what motivates people. And the same is true in the academic world. But just as if footballers move and end up at United or City or Liverpool or whatever, doesn't necessarily work out as they expected it to. And I think the same is true in universities. Some of the things you expect are going to happen or will be the case actually don't happen at all. And you expect problems to not be there, and they are there. So maybe it's just the fact that these are common problems across all universities, but they approach them in different ways. It's about the balance, but really it's about the balance between teaching and research.
Yes.
That's the fundamental difference. If you move to Manchester, then the whole emphasis was on research, and teaching was kind of almost like a side issue. Whereas, of course, in a place like Bolton, quite rightly, teaching is the centrality, and research is the add-on. So getting the balance right in any institution, I think, is tricky.
What do you think the balance should be, from your personal opinion?
That's a really, really good question. And I'm not sure there is any simple answer to that. For reasons I don't fully understand, it has always been the case that promotion in a university, even within a university or between universities, is almost always based on research record, publications, grant income, so on and so forth. If people get promoted for teaching excellence, generally speaking, that's very rare, and it's normally within a particular strand. So you become a teaching fellow, or you become a teaching something or other. I mean, from quite early on, I kind of aspired to be a professor. I'm not sure that I ever thought that I perhaps would achieve that, but I certainly aspired. Promotion in universities is very narrow when you think about it. You know, you go in as a lecturer, you can become a senior lecturer, although that's often much more of an administrative post than necessarily a research post. If you're research active, you can then move to perhaps be a reader, and then ultimately, you know, you end up as a professor. But if you're going to aspire to be a professor, then really that becomes all about research. So you have to focus on that, which means you have to be pretty selfish about what you do. And this is why we have such tensions in universities, because even people who are really, really good teachers, lecturers, don't feel that they're rewarded for that. So why put the effort in, as it were, which of course is wrong as an attitude, but has to be understood. Whereas, and this is a much bigger deal, in my experience over many years, you get really, really first-class researchers who are god-awful teachers. Seriously. I remember, I won't name names or places, but I've been a head of school in three different institutions, and you know, that's where the tensions really play out when you're trying to manage your staff. And I remember having one guy in front of me. We were discussing his annual assessment, and I'd just taken over as the head, so I was going through all the people, and I was trying to say to this guy, he'd been in the job for 25 years, and he'd never published, right? Never published a thing. So I was trying to coax out of him why he'd never, you know, in 25 years, in a top class university, he'd never published. And then we got onto his teaching record, and it was just awful. I mean, the student assessments and the reports were just awful. And I said to him, you know, on the one hand, you know, you haven't published anything, and on the other hand, you're teaching. Although he had one module, which was an option, which about 12 kids did. And they thought he was wonderful. They thought he was the absolute bee's knees. Because of course, that was his area. That was the one thing that really turned him on. And he said to me, this is absolutely true. I kid you not. In the course, he just looked at his feet and he said, I hate teaching. And I hate it. He said, oh, he said, just thinking about having to go into a classroom. And I sat there thinking, you know, and I mean, again, that's an extreme story, but it's not that unusual. You get a lot of top class researchers in particular who really, they don't like teaching, they don't like students, and they don't want to do it. They just want to be left to get on with their research, and that sometimes happens. And as long as their research is top class, you know, as long as their research is international level and it's bringing in millions, fine. Don't put them anywhere near students, you know, for God's sake. So yeah, it's.
What's the answer then?
There is no answer. There is no single answer. I mean, I'm making light of it, but it's a very serious matter. I think that what Bolton has done, interestingly, over the last few years, is certainly one of the best overt attempts I've seen with what they call the TIRI strategy. This recognition that it is essentially a teaching institution, and that teaching has to be done as well as it possibly can be. And I do think that the level of support that my colleagues give to their undergraduate students is phenomenal compared to most places I've ever worked. But they really have to work hard at it. But of course, then the problem is on the other side. The problem is trying to get people to do research and publish when they quite rightly have this imposition, if you like, this loading on them of class and marking and administration. So then you push it the other way. I think Salford got it right for a few years. We tried to give the two equal status, completely equal status. And we did it by creating institutes. So you would be a member of staff in a given school. So in my case, for example, I was in computer science at the time, or you'd be in engineering, or you'd be in psychology or whatever. So you would be in a school. But if you were an active researcher, and that has to be defined and measured, then you joined a research institute. Okay. So for your research, you were managed by the institute. For your teaching, you were managed by the school. Now that created tensions between the two, but that was all right. The tensions have to be somewhere. It's a balance, right? And we try to get the balance with most universities have what they call workload models, okay? And lecturers, any member of staff will have an allotted number of hours in a given academic year, okay? That's defined. And then they'll get X hours for teaching, Y hours for research, Z hours for administration. And it's getting that balance between X, Y, and Z. That's what is absolutely crucial. And as I say, it depends on the institution as to where they place the emphasis. So you get huge differences. At Salford, I think we got it just about as good as it could be, but it still created tensions. That's what I'm saying. And of course, ultimately, and I know this is going to sound obvious, but I do really believe this, universities only do two things. They teach and they research. And I firmly believe that to be a university, you have to do both, right? Both. Yeah. So if you only teach, you're a completely different kind of institution. And I think that's a big danger in where we're going in the UK. There's this idea that we can create teaching only institutions. I think that will be a disaster.
Why?
Well, because if you're not researching, right, if anybody, any academic is not actively researching, then what are they teaching? What are they telling their students? Right, you've absolutely got to be researching, even if it's just at a personal level, not talking about necessarily publishing or writing monographs or whatever it might be. It might be at the individual level, but if you're not actively researching your field, you've no right to be stood in front of classes telling students, not in this day and age. But equally, if you're research only, then you're not disseminating, you're not enthusing your students, you're not inspiring them to be the next generation of researchers. So I really do believe there has to be a combination of those two in balance and managed in balance. But as I say, getting the right balance is the challenge.
Difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
Looking back,
yeah.
What would you have advised yourself when you were not write your proposal on a BMAT?
No, that's right. Yes, not to fill out an application form in a pub would be one thing. No, that's actually not the lesson learned. That's a really great question, Lyndsey, and I have asked myself that same question many times over the years. I'll just tell you one further story about that time. When I went in to tell my boss, who was the director of finance for the group, he was a very aggressive young Welshman, and I was pretty much his protege. Yeah, he'd taken me on and he'd moved me. I think he saw in me, kind of like a little version of himself, I think. But so I arranged to see him. I went into his office to tell him I was leaving to do a PhD. And he looked me up and down as though I'd just crawled out from the gutter. And he said, "Get out of my office. You're a waste of space." He said, I won't tell you exactly what he said because it's too rude. But he very forcibly told me that PhDs were 2 a penny. He could buy and sell them. You know, he said, just get out of my office. He said, you are wasting my time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that was a bit tough. And several years later, I think must have been on a plane or on a train or something, because for some reason I was thumbing through a copy of the Financial Times, and there was a feature on him. I always remember this. And he'd just been appointed as the youngest chief executive of the entire group of companies. He'd gone from being the director of finance of this one company to the CEO of the entire group. Right. So I think maybe I should have followed his advice and followed on his coattails. But I'll never forget the way he looked at me. It was just completely, you know, disbelief and disgust on his face.
Wow. Wonder why.
So I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, have I asked myself that question many, many times? Yes. I think my advice to my younger self, all right, this is really good. This is a good question. Right, you've set me off thinking again now. So it wouldn't be about whether or not to do it. That was absolutely right decision. Whether it was the beer talking or, you know, I think there were some. I think there were some big underlying issues, that's fine. So I've never for a moment regretted the decision. That was fine. What I would tell my younger self are some very hard lessons about doing research and being an academic. I think I made a number of mistakes when I gave my inaugural lecture at Salford. It suddenly came to me in the middle of doing my inaugural. A lot of my old friends were there who'd been profs like me over the same period of time, and I'd known them for many years. And I actually said in the inaugural that I had made 3 fundamental mistakes in my professional career, and I knew every one of them. And I actually knew at the time. Funnily enough, I did know at the time. Anyway, afterwards, when we were having the reception, they were all dying to know what were the 3 mistakes, but I wouldn't tell them because they were too personal. But looking back with hindsight, as I said, I think I actually did recognize them at the time, but for other reasons, I made the wrong choices. I recovered from them, but it took me a lot longer than perhaps it would have done had I known those things. You know, you try and impart that to your students, but I'm not sure you can. You can't live people's lives for them. It's like with your children. You know, you can try and tell your children not to do this, not to do that. Don't make the mistakes I did, and they go ahead and make them anyway. And I think the same is true of research. I have a very, very good friend, an old friend of mine who's also a prof at Manchester. We've known each other for donkey's years. And up until the lockdown, we used to meet regularly for a drink and a chat at old times. And we'd always have much the same conversation. But one thing I always say to him, I joined him at Salford in 1992, deliberately moved to Salford to work with him, because I'd known him for many years. He taught me more about research and still teaches me more about research than any other person I've ever known. And that's the other thing I think I would say. It sounds a little bit pompous, but I think it's important, particularly if your colleagues, your PhD fellows, etc., are thinking of having academic careers. Okay, and not everybody does these days, but if they are thinking about an academic career, to recognize that research is that total commitment. It's not the PhD. It's not the writing of a couple of. It is that total commitment to research over the length of their careers. And I still learn. You used to have a very famous prof called Reg Revens, who was a prof at Manchester, who I knew through some friends of mine. Wonderful man, remarkable man. Lived up into his 80s or 90s, I think. And people were always clamoring with Revens for him to be their supervisor. You'd get mail after mail, and letter after letter. You know, dear Professor Revens, you know, you've inspired me. I've read your books. You're a great person. Blah blah blah. You know, please, will you be my director of studies? And Reverends would always say to them, only if I can learn something from you. All right, and that stuck with me. That's remarkable. That, you know, for him, it wasn't what he could give them that was that important, but what he got back from them. And I think that's absolutely true. If you're not learning anything from your students, then you're not listening, or you're not taking notice. So
that's really important. Yeah,
I think it is. Yeah, it should be very much a, you know, that form of relay, that giving and take. It's not always. I know, yeah, you get many senior academics, particularly in certain disciplines, where, you know, they are the experts. They know this, and they tell their PhD students what to do. Go and do this. You know, carry out these experiments. Do this, and that'll get you a PhD. And it probably will. I'm not saying they're wrong, but that for me is not the nature of the experience.
No. So what are your 3 mistakes?
I'm not going to tell you. I can tell you vaguely. Generally, what I can't tell you is the reasons why I made the mistakes. Those are 2 personal. The 3 mistakes were broadly not joining a particular research group at one university, but opting for some friends of mine who I'd known for a long. I admired very much, and I let that sway me. I joined them.
Your heart out your head.
I get distracted very easily, and IT is quite a difficult area because it is, in some sense, it's very fashionable. Yeah. So unlike some disciplines, maybe psychology, for example, or sociology, or certain areas where there are very strong issues that are always going to be there and which people are trying to find out different answers to over time. Technology is always about the technology of the day. So we tend to follow trends, which I actually think is wrong and self-defeating, but it's kind of understandable. So over the years, I've tended to flit from topic to topic to topic. And one thing you have to do as an academic, if you are going to make a career, is to create an identity for yourself. Yeah, you have to be known. Get yourself known in a particular area or a particular topic or a particular philosophical approach. That's if you want to be known. Okay. People should know what you stand for, what you're about. And I didn't do that. I kind of went with a group because I liked them, and it was very enjoyable. I had a great time, but they were a bit too much like me. We were too similar. Whereas the group that wanted me to join them were much more focused, much more direct. And if I'd done as I was told, I probably could have got to being a professor much faster than I did in the end. One was I opted out of writing a book with 2 friends of mine, which went on to become very popular and very influential. And I was one of the main drivers of that book, but for various personal reasons, I kind of dropped out and left it to them. And that was a huge mistake, absolutely huge mistake. And then the third one was a particular move that I made. Again, I let emotions rule the decision. And that was a dreadful mistake. That took me 6 or 7 years to recover from. Just made the wrong choice, wrong place to go, wrong time. Again, ultimately it worked out, but it really did take me 6 or 7 years to recover. So
don't make decisions on emotions.
Well, that could be one. That could be one lesson. Yeah, maybe. But then, then there are other benefits that come from emotion, not so much from rationality. But it is interesting. I think that, and in a way, I did recognize at the time. It wasn't that I didn't understand the risks, but I opted.
Yeah.
The one way, and I should, if thinking back, you were saying about offering advice, that would have been very clear. But then, of course, you don't know what that would have led to.
Exactly.
You know, you have to go back, and that's all you can say. I have 3 sons, and a couple of years ago now, was my 70th birthday, and all the 3 boys came up. They all live in different parts of the country now, but they all came, and we went out to celebrate, and they took me out. We went to the cricket, and we went for a lovely meal, and we were sat outside in the evening, and my eldest said to me, "So, Dad," he said, "what have you learned?" Come on, he said, you know, get to 70. What's this wisdom? Tell us what you've learned. And again, I kind of thought about it, and it came to me. I said, well, if everything that's happened has led me to this point tonight with you, that's been worth it.
Oh.
And I meant it. No, I meant it. It suddenly occurred, and it's the same with the job. Yeah. You know, I ended up as a professor at the University of Manchester. Apart from playing for United and winning the Champions League with them, I can't, you know, I couldn't have done any more. So even if the route was like that, even the route was circuitous and mistakes made, you know, where I ended up was all right.
I think that's a really good point to end on, don't you? Where I ended up was all right.
Yeah, well, what else can I say? You know, I can't, as with your question, I can't say I should have done this, I should have done that. If I was being, it was a point I made to you some time ago about this, and I do think it, unfortunately, it's quite important. You have to be selfish if you really want to succeed as an academic. I think there's an essence of being very self-focused. Maybe selfish is slightly the wrong word. I remember being in Barcelona for a conference a number of years ago. We were walking down the Ramblas, about 7 or 8 of us, and it was a time when most of us were at Salford. There were a couple of people there from Oxford and Cambridge who were good friends of ours we'd known for a long time. And one of them was a very eminent professor, very well-known professor in the field. And we were talking about PhD students. And somebody said to him, well, you know, how many are you supervising? And he said, a half. What do you mean a half? He said, well, I have 1 part-time PhD student. Right?
Oh.
And we looked at each other, and I think generally speaking, we used to average about 6 to 8 a year, because we thought that was very much part of our, you know, part of being a professor, part of being an academic was, I mean, the guy I mentioned who's a very good friend of mine, he normally has 10 to 12 at any one time, but when he was working, because to him that was very much, he didn't have to do any undergraduate teaching or anything else effectively. But if he wasn't surrounded by a good cohort of PhD students, then to him it wasn't worth doing. But to this other guy, they were just a pain in the backside. Seriously, I'm not being nasty. You know, because he was taking this, you know, how am I going to write? How am I going to write a 3-star, 4-star paper every 3 months, every 6 months, if I'm distracted by having PhD students who need me to help them or need me to guide them? So I don't do it. That was his point. So
learn off the first guy and just see them 3 times in 3 years.
Yeah, that's all right in science. Doesn't really work in our area. But yeah, that's what I mean. You know, different models, different viewpoints. Yeah. So you make choices and you do what you do. But your question was about what would I tell myself? Well, I think that would be the main lesson that I would tell myself, about being somewhat more focused, perhaps a little bit more ruthless than I was at times. But
look at where you are.
We got there in the end.
Well, it's been really good to talk to you. I'm going to press stop on the recording, okay?
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.